We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Welcome again to Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. I'm Marlon Detweiler, and today we have with us a dear old friend, Tom Garfield. I say old because I've known him a long time, not because he doesn't have hair or because of his age. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. But that's both true there. So,
hey, tell us about yourself a little bit, you, your family, and that sort of thing before we get into the subject matter.
Sure. Originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan. So this is my water bottle, if you can see that.
Oh boy, you're going to create controversy with that.
So anyway, so the short version now, born and raised there. And so, it's in my blood. But after the Navy, came out here to Moscow, Idaho. It's in the panhandle of Idaho. Got to be good friends with the Jim Wilson family back in Ann Arbor. Jim had 4 children, among which was Doug Wilson of some fame. And anyway, but we got to know each other in high school, got together a number of times in the Navy. And then afterwards, I came out here to go to the University of Idaho. And anyway, as the Lord would have it, as I was finishing my art degree at the University of Idaho, fully intending to be an art teator.
But you're an art teacher.
Well, I am an art teacher, yes.
That's not all you are, but you are an art teacher.
But that's all I was going to be. And anyway, Doug accosted me with the idea one day in 1980 of heading up a school that they were putting together, at that time, a classical Christian school was not in the works. Nobody was talking classical. It was just a non-denominational Christian school so that his daughter would be able to get a Christian education and not have to go to the public schools, basically. So felt the Lord was leading me into that. And we opened in September of 81 as Logos School here in Moscow. And
Logos School, of which you were the superintendent, sometimes called the headmaster or head of school, was where you went to work at doing that job and teaching art. It started in 1981, as you said, but you mentioned something that I need you to unpack a bit, and that was that you were originally simply starting a Christian school. How did it become a classical Christian school? And while you're at it, talk a little bit about the impact that Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, the book that we have become familiar with, maybe even how that book came about and how you've seen it have impact around the world.
Sure. I failed to mention, you asked about my family or my background. I just focused right on the school. But yeah, my wife, Julie, is a native here in Moscow. Actually, she's like 4th generation Moscow. Wow. Anyway, we have 4 children and now 11 grandchildren. But anywho, so Doug, really, he was the impetus for starting Logos, and I'm not kidding about his daughter. His daughter Becca was really the driving force as a child. In other words, Nancy, his wife, was a driving force to get the school started. And it's funny. There at the time, there of course were public schools here, but there was an Adventist school here and a Catholic school here. Excuse me, but nothing non-denominational. And so that was really the point. That was to start a non-denominational one. Well, I remember at a board meeting, there were 4 of us. I was on the board as well as being the principal. Excuse me. And I remember when Doug brought this article to our board meeting called The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers.
Sure.
And we read it and we all kind of went, well, that's cool. You got to remember this was just out of the 70s, so of course it was cool. And we all thought, at least I think we did, we all thought, well, this sounds great. We have no idea what this means or how it would look, but shoot, let's give it a try. What could go wrong?
Yeah, what can go wrong?
What could go wrong? But it was really, what we didn't realize, none of us really did. What we didn't realize was that Sayre's approach was very pedagogical. And that is how to teach as well as what to teach, but mostly how to teach. And we didn't know how to teach anything. And so everything was a hard lesson. And we quickly figured out that the materials that we had bought for our Christian school from a company that will remain unnamed, but it's certainly not Veritas, obviously. It wasn't, but they're still around. And but we quickly figured out we were trying to essentially screw in a screw with a hammer, and it wasn't working well. And so there's nothing wrong with materials, but it was just the wrong approach. And so we very quickly actually had to redo our entire curriculum and start making some of our own supplies, some of our own curriculum material, because it wasn't out there. And so we had to go, what are we doing? And we started searching high and low for anything. We came across John Saxon and his math approach. Well, we liked it because he incorporated review, okay? We also came across a book called The 7 Laws of Teaching, and that radicalized so much of how we thought about teaching. I won't go into that right now. We also came across Brenda Shirley, not her personally, but, well, actually sort of through her videotapes. Yeah. And I have to tell you, if a lot of your listeners would know about the Shirley method. Shirley is, I don't know if she's still living, but
she is in Arkansas.
Okay. Well, yeah, Arkansas. So she has this amazing accent. And I remember my teachers in North Idaho watching her talk about verbs, nouns, adjectives, and we figured it out. Really good. Thanks. But again, it's this pattern of chanting and sing-song and memorization that fits with the grammar stage, right? And so we found these things. Well, for about the first 10 years of our existence, at almost every board meeting, there was a debate, okay? And there were only 4 of us, and then there were 6. There was a debate. What is classical education? But what is it really? And we kept going back to Sayre's protocol and looking at it, and it kind of broke down into 2 possible interpretations. One is it largely about classical era languages, texts, the tested works of Western civilization, right? Content. Is it largely that, or is it largely pedagogical? Okay. That debate we had for about 10 years, almost at every board meeting, okay? I went ahead and did it in the school as though it was pedagogical, okay? Because that's all I could figure out. And I mean, yes, of course, we brought in Latin and eventually Greek and that kind of thing, but largely it was pedagogical. Well, then in 1991, Doug had the opportunity, he was asked to write a book on education for a series called the Turning Point series by Crossway Publishers. And they asked him to write a book on education. So he said to himself, I suppose, I'm going to write about Logos's experience trying to do this.
Well, clearly he was being asked because of the Logos experience that he had had. How did he get discovered for that?
That's a good question. It was Marvin Alasky was the publisher at the time. And I don't know how he and Doug got connected, but they had a connection. And Doug could tell you more about that. So I don't know if Marvin knew about the connection with Logos. I suppose he did. But anyway, Doug used Logos as kind of here's how we're doing this classical thing. And we discovered this classical thing. And Doug essentially planted the flag. Got on the top of Mount Everest and said, this is it. And this is what we mean by classical. It's pedagogical with, and of course, an importance of what we would also call some classical curricula. Well, that ended the discussion at our board meeting because now we were identified with that article on a pedagogical basis. But it also did this thing, this proverbial stuff hitting the fan. In 91, you don't have the internet. Not quite yet. Al Gore hadn't quite gotten his act together yet. But you had, still this ability for people to read. Well, Doug's book became, the next in a series that already, I believe, had about 13,000 readership, people lined up for it. So it wasn't just a book all by itself. It came out as something that people were already reading, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, it just, everything went nuts. We got calls, phone calls at the school, phone calls at Doug's house, letters to the school, letters to Doug saying, not, how do we get to Moscow and go to your school, but rather, how do we do this where we live?
Yeah.
Okay. That was the huge question. How do we do this in our place? We also heard, sadly, that the Christian schools, by and large, had been failing, okay? Failing at least these people that were curious about doing something else. So many people resonated with the idea of, this is what I've been looking for. This is what we want for our children. And this is not what's being provided by our local Christian school. So there was not even a, oh, we hate the public schools thing. I mean, that wasn't even part of the conversation. It was from people who wanted a Christian education, had pursued a Christian education, but were very disappointed. And so that's it just went nuts. And I went to Doug at one point, I don't remember time or date or whatever, but I said, Doug, we're getting flooded here. I can't run the school and help these people much as I want to.
Yeah.
We would send them, whatever we could, copies of our curriculum guide if we, put them in the mail. So anyway, Doug, I'm not saying I fostered the idea. I don't think I did, but Doug saw what was happening. He was getting the calls and the letters too. And so he said, this is ridiculous. We need to push this away from Logos in one sense and start its own organization. Well, you and Lori obviously had been aware of what was going on. You were excited by the book as well.
Our reading of Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning was what got us excited. And it was literally the finish of that reading that we gathered there were 4 couples that gathered in our home on May 26, 1992.
Wow.
Discuss and at that moment commit to starting the Geneva School in Orlando as a result of reading the book, talking to Doug, etc. So there's just a little back.
That's interesting. Well, then, yeah. So you were on this mailing list. Like I said, this is all done pre-internet. Doug had written the book, Recovering the Lost Tools, so hence the Lost Tools. And we decided, hey, let's have a conference of all the people that are interested in this thing out here in Moscow, because of course Moscow is so easy to get to. Let's just do it, in a hub of civilization.
We'll make sure these people are committed.
Yes, it's a winnowing process. And so we set that, and I believe it was July of '93 that we had it.
Actually, it was that year, it was 92, because it was my first call with Doug that he also mentioned, come on out here, which was only essentially when we first talked, I think. Well, I don't remember, but it was only a few weeks later.
Okay. Well, so we had this conference, and here at Logos, or here in Moscow at Logos, and about 70 people showed up, as I recall, and you guys were among them. And at that time, Doug, you, Tom Spencer, and I got together in the staff room one evening.
Oh, and that was 93.
That was 93.
First conference, yes. There was not an initiative to start an association. I think that the conference itself probably was a catalyst for Doug thinking about what do we need to do about this? And the answer that he came up with, we need to start an association.
That sounds right. Yes, thank you. Yes. So yeah, so it was in the summer of '93 that, yeah, you guys came out again, and we had this, somebody had drawn up these papers. I don't know if you did that, or anyway, it
They
looked
were done before I was connected. Doug invited me
okay.
to join before getting there to be part of the founding board, but the paperwork had been done prior to that.
Right. So yeah, so we the four of us said, yeah, let's do this, and signed the documents forming the ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools. And subsequently, I had a visit out to you guys that August as you got Geneva going, and that was hot.
It's Orlando, what can I tell you?
Well, I wasn't expecting, I don't know, it's North Idaho,
If you
right?
live in a city that has a one-day long July 4th as your summer, you got to expect it's going to be hot somewhere else compared to what you're used to.
Well, it sure was. And yeah, so anyway, then yeah, subsequently we had, I think, a couple more conferences here in Moscow, and finally people said, you really need to take this on the road. And what they meant by that is go where people live. And so yeah, so then in '96 we went out to Raleigh and had our first good sized conference. I think about 400 people showed up for that, and then away we went. So yeah, so that's kind of the short version of how Logos got going, and then ACCS as an obvious spinoff from that.
But what was really cool was you were the head of the first school. It was out of your community that the book was written on classical ed. We found that there were actually some other schools that kind of germinated. I remember at least one, Care Paravel in Topeka, Kansas, and they became associated quickly, and so there was connection there and some energy. My experience in getting familiar with the book was that R.C. Sproul recommended it to me when I asked him some questions on education. He had become familiar with it through Ty Willis.
Oh yeah,
read it, and because of that had become part of founding Regent School of Austin. I don't know what his role was related to founding. I assume he was part of the foundation, and I'm fairly certain that he would have learned about the book from Marvin Olasky because I believe there's some connection there. So it's kind of interesting how all that came together. So your career at Logos was how long as the head of school?
Well, I was the head of school for 35 years. And within that time, taught a lot of classes, taught art classes, which was, I laugh because, I thought I was totally getting something new when the Lord said, okay, now I want you to do this administrative thing, which I had zero experience in preparing for. I literally laughed at Doug when he first broached the idea. And instead I did 35 years of it, but taught art basically from day one, and haven't stopped since. So
that's incredible. So how long ago did you retire from Logos?
5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was maybe 4 years ago that you came to work with us?
Yeah, about 4.5 years ago.
Shortly after retiring, what were you thinking? I thought you were retiring.
Well, I was retiring from Logos, but I didn't want to stop life. And so I started a little academy, just an arts thing called Heritage Arts, downtown Moscow. And we put on plays, and I would do art classes and, just things. We do wine and paint nights. But anyway, then you guys got a hold of me a few months later, and the idea of getting back into administration sounded really fun, especially when I didn't have to be the top guy.
Tell us about your title and what you do day in and day out with Veritas Scholars Academy, our online school.
Well, when you particularly talked to me, I talked to Bob first, of course, but Bob Cannon is my boss. He's, as many of your people know, Dr. Bob Cannon is my boss, the headmaster of the academy. But when I realized, when you spoke to me, and I realized I wouldn't be the final guy, the top guy with all those headaches, and I wouldn't have any board meetings to go through. And I had nothing to do with money. It's like, yes, I can do this. So no, I'm the, it was a win all the way around. So yeah, as Dean of Academics, my main role is to observe and evaluate our teachers. And since we archive everything, our teachers are online, and we archive all their classes, I don't need to disturb their classes to observe them. And so I watch their archives, excuse me, and send them a summary report. And that was one of the things I enjoyed doing at Logos. It was hard to get to, as every administrator knows. It's one of these ironic things. It's one of the most important things you can do. Yeah. And it's one of the least things done, because it just takes time. And anyway, so I really am delighted to do it. And I get to teach several art classes for Veritas as well. So that's been fun.
You like, but I would say ACCS today had a very suspect view of online education. And I did too when we first started. But this is about me, this is about you. Tell us about the journey and where you find yourself with regard to your concerns for the effectiveness of online education.
Sure. Well, yeah, I go so far back, and so do you, that we remember when there weren't really computers and such, right? So that's how far back we go. So I won't go through all that, but Logos did grow up. Logos grew in the 80s when microcomputers were just coming online, so to speak.
Sure.
PCs were a thing, became a thing, and everybody's trying to figure out, how does this work in education? Bill Clinton told us that it was, the best thing on the planet to make kids smarter, and of course we had reason to doubt him. So we all had to kind of shift our paradigm and go, well, how does this work? How does this fit in? Is it just a tool, whatever? Anyway, that's important to know because of course online depends on computers, and we got our view of computers early on, unlike the millennials, right? They were born in them. We had to figure out what they meant. And so when online education started cropping up, I admit, yeah, I was one of the many who thought, oh, seriously, as if the kids don't watch enough TV already or whatever, right? And, I had this image of them sitting in a basement somewhere where this, like Neo in the Matrix or something. And just this wasted, pale person and watching some teacher tell them things, and then they fill out a workbook, or I don't know. And I just thought, oh, that can't be good. And so that was honestly my initial view was, if you can't, I suppose if you can't do the best thing with, being in person, then yeah, watch a recording of somebody and do your best, right? Get something out of it. But yeah, I had to have my paradigm completely changed. For one thing, when you started bringing this idea of an online school to the ACCS board meeting and saying, this is really viable. This is really a thing that's working, and it's working well for thousands of kids. I freely admit, you and I always, we cross swords more than once, but when we usually ended up agreeing. So that was always funny. I have to say parenthetically that,
I like it when I'm right when we disagreed at first.
Yeah, that's me too. Yeah, that's the best, right? But yeah, I remember a number of board members going, wait, Marlon and Tom are agreeing. This has got to be the right thing. So, so it was our secret ploy. Anyway, but when you were talking about it, I thought, how can that possibly be any kind of a serious school? They're just using computers. How can they, do this? So as I became more familiar with it, what was interesting, Marlon, you may not know this, a year before I retired from Logos, Roman Roads curriculum, Roman Roads Press here in Moscow, Daniel Fukushan, one of the owners of that, asked me to do an art class for them on their online. And well, okay. And it was early enough in the morning that I wouldn't disrupt my daily schedule. And so I went on, it was twice a week, and had, I don't know, half a dozen students or something, and really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. And so in a sense, it was like I had this little warm up to what I was going to be doing, and I didn't know it. And so when I left Logos and I was picked up by you guys, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of know how this can work online. And my view completely changed.
Yeah.
So
it is truly, my experience, I've said this before in a number of contexts, including an episode of Veritas Vox, and that is, I knew it was timely. I knew it was important. I knew technology would develop in ways that I couldn't even imagine to make it better, but I didn't know how good it would actually be. And in our first year of doing classes, which is now 18 years ago, I was blown away by how good it was. The teacher's ability to communicate verbally with things on screen, videos, taking them to websites, all those kinds of things, some of which they can do better with a computer than they can in a classroom. And the students' ability to communicate and interact was far better than I ever imagined. And it is, in a word, better than I thought it would be.
Well, it certainly is. Yes, for me too. It certainly was eye-opening, because for me, you know, the kids were, of course, the whole point, and for you too, the kids were the whole point. And making sure they had an interactive relationship with their other peers and the teacher, very, very important. And I just didn't see how that could happen online. Well, of course it does. And they're real kids and they're real teachers, and they connect. And one of the amazing things that I don't know, at least it was an epiphany for me, was, as I've told the kids too, when I was at Logos, I, in a sense, invited all these kids to come into my classroom for history or art or whatever. And it was great. And it is great. And, you know, I got to know them and see them in the hallways and that sort of thing. With online, they're inviting me into their homes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I have a classroom, and they come to that, but more realistically, I'm coming into their homes. They're coming into each other's homes and seeing each other where they live, seeing their pets many times, seeing sibs, sometimes seeing parents, seeing outside. I had a girl in Brazil, you know, and she was always outside. And, you know, just this wondrous connection between, not just between the kids, but between kids internationally, kids in Florida talking with kids in Texas and Idaho, and, you know, every place in between. Kids who would never meet each other absent this connection, right? So the kids at Logos, wonderful. Kids in any Christian schools, wonderful. But they all kind of course, live in the same area because they have to. The teachers all live in the same area because they have to. And instead now we get together, and we would never meet these people if we hadn't had this vehicle. So
it was an unforeseen benefit to have multiple cultures and multiple perspectives be in one place for learning and discussion. Yeah,
exactly.
We're running out of time, and there's a question I want to get to, so I'm going to cut that part off for now and move to something else. You've been around classical Christian education's revival about as long as anyone, because of your involvement at Logos, beginning in 1981 through today. do the math here, 41 years.
What you have to remember is I was 14, so that was, you know.
What have you seen progress, and where do you see the future?
Well, on the positive side, where I've seen the progress is the development of the program both nationally and internationally, like I said. Veritas has been a great help toward that. In fact, I think uniquely benefited many thousands that way. I mean, to be fair, I mean, the local Christian classical school can't be expected to be an international influence.
Right.
Okay. But taken as a whole, classical education now is an international movement. And I just think that's wonderful, because when we first started in the idea of anything being, cross-cultural, sounds good, but, is it really? Is classical education really for every culture? Well, yeah, actually it is, because it's for every kid. Anyway, so I'm pleased by that. I'm pleased by the, of course, sheer numbers of kids and families that are being blessed this way across the world. The amount of educators who are giving themselves to it. Now we have second generation educators, as well as, of course, second generation students, alum kids coming to schools. So there's a generational shift, as it should be, happening. The baton is being passed as it should be. Now, that's the good side. I'm pleased by the amount of books being written and that sort of thing. What I'm concerned about is the initial, this is kind of ironic, because the initial debate that we had in our little tiny board meeting here in little tiny Moscow is still there. It's still, what is classical education? Is it content driven? Is it pedagogically driven? Okay. My concern on that has grown, and now is really quite high, because obviously I'm a pedagogical, guru that way. But my concern with the content is that it becomes less and less about the ability of the teacher and the character of the teacher than it is about the material. And when you go that direction, and I know it sounds, doomsaying, but when you go that direction, then it becomes kind of the big tent approach. Theological lines get blurred. And pretty soon you lose so much of what Sayers has, but far more importantly, you lose what I believe is the clear biblical message of what education is supposed to be. I think by broadening the tent, if you will, say, well, we can involve all sorts of people of faith. Yeah, but then you're not Christian anymore. Yeah. So anyway, so that is a very great concern I have.
Yeah, it's been my sense that first and foremost, the classical and classical Christian education, and this is where we are at Veritas, is about a comprehensive application of the trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, or logic used for dialectic, and understanding that
Yep.
informs how we teach and to some extent what we teach.
Yep.
Because the idea, when I talk to people about whether or not they've had people that have had Latin, run into somebody who went to a Catholic school, yeah, I had Latin, or somebody that's our age, yeah, we had Latin as an alternative to Spanish or French, or in my case, German. But the reason we teach Latin is so different, and it's not about that or a modern foreign language. It's, as far as I'm concerned, primarily a tool of leverage for mastering language, which happens substantially in grammar school. And so it informs when the content happens. And as you know, we have this thing called the omnibus, the great books, and that's about content, but it's more about ideas and discussing ideas that have influenced education and people over years, and applying them within the confines or within the structure of this pedagogical model. And so there's a sense in which my answer to your question would be content is important, but not as important as getting the method, the pedagogy in place. And so the two of them together are where we're trying to be, and you've been a wonderful part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Do you want to say something in closing? I thought it sounded like you were going to say something.
Oh, no, that's fine. That is a good closure. Yes, obviously, I don't want people to think that I don't I don't care about content, but like you said, the content guides us in that sense. But it's as Sarah says, it's kind of grist for the mill, which doesn't sound very particular, but it is. And that's where, again, the whole cultural aspect is so important. By focusing on the pedagogical side, you can bring in local culture into your school program wherever you are, as opposed to, oh, we're just going to follow the Western world, kind of idea. But no, I'm very delighted. I'm thrilled that my grandchildren, all of my 11 grandchildren, are getting a classical education in various places, and I'm hugely grateful for that.
You've been with us on Veritas Vox with Tom Garfield and me, Marlon Detweiler. Thank you for joining us.